All right, today we're diving into one of Christianity's most fascinating and, let's be honest, most debated ideas, the pre-tribulation rapture. This is the belief that Christians will be suddenly whisked away from Earth before a final, intense period of global judgment. So let's break down the case for it piece by piece. So let's just jump right in with the first question you'll almost always hear when this topic comes up. It's a challenge that really gets to the heart of the whole thing. And you know what? The straight-up answer is no. The English word rapture, spelled just like that, doesn't show up anywhere in the biblical text.
But, okay, that simple no just opens up a way bigger, more interesting question. If the word itself isn't in there, where does this whole idea even come from? Well, proponents argue that the concept is absolutely woven throughout the scriptures, even if it doesn't have that specific label.
The case for the concept of the rapture doesn't start in English at all. It actually starts with a single Greek word found in the original New Testament writings. And that word is harpazo. Now, this isn't some gentle, floating up kind of word. It has some force behind it. It means to seize, to carry off by force, or to snatch away. And this is the exact word the Apostle Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians when he describes believers being caught up to meet the Lord. This single word, really, is the linguistic bedrock of the whole idea. And what's really cool is you can literally follow this word's journey through history. It's like a linguistic detective story. The Greek harpazo got translated into Latin as raptumer. Over the centuries, that evolved into raptura, and eventually it landed in English as the word we all know today, rapture. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This word, harpazo, it's not a one-hit wonder in the Bible. The same word is used to describe how Philip was supernaturally transported from one place to another, and how Paul himself was caught up to heaven. For proponents, this just reinforces that harpazo means a sudden, miraculous physical removal. Okay, so that's the language part of the argument. But the next piece of the puzzle is this idea of a historical pattern in the Bible, a repeated theme where God removes the faithful before he brings judgment. The very first example they point to is a guy named Enoch. His story is, well, it's pretty wild. He apparently walked so closely with God that instead of dying, God just took him. He's seen as a type, or a kind of sneak preview of the rapture. And then you've got the prophet Elijah. I mean, his exit is one of the most cinematic moments in the entire Old Testament. A chariot of fire shows up, and he's taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Another powerful image of someone being physically taken from the earth. So you see the pattern they're building here, right? It's not just about individuals. Think about Noah, safely tucked away in the ark before the floodwaters came. Or Lot, being physically dragged out of the city of Sodom right before it was destroyed. The argument is that God's method is consistent. Removal equals protection. Okay, so all these patterns and definitions, they're all leading up to what is really the heart of the argument. And it's all about this fundamental conflict. It's a promise made to believers versus the very purpose of that end times period called the tribulation. So look at it this way. On one side of the ledger, you've got these repeated promises that believers are saved from God's wrath, that they are not appointed to it. But on the other side, the tribulation is explicitly, repeatedly described as the very moment that God's wrath is poured out on the earth. So how can both of those things be true at the same time? For proponents, the only answer is that believers have to be removed first. All right, so we've looked at direct language and historical patterns. Now let's get into the symbolism, because the case also relies on using ancient traditions as a key to sort of unlock prophetic texts. Now this is a really fascinating one. Proponents see the ancient Jewish wedding tradition as a perfect picture, a living parable, really, for the relationship between Christ the groom and the church, his bride. The groom pays a price, he goes away to prepare a home, and then he comes back, often unexpectedly and with a shout, to snatch his bride away. The parallels, they argue, are just too strong to ignore. And the symbolism doesn't stop there. When you get to the book of Revelation, proponents say you can actually see what looks like two distinct groups of saints. They're described differently, they wear different things, and most importantly, they have very different experiences. One group is in heaven for a wedding supper, while the other group is coming out of the great tribulation on earth, many as martyrs. So what's the takeaway here? Well, the argument is that for the church, the bride, to be returning with Christ at the end of it all, they must have been taken up to heaven before that second group of tribulation saints even comes into existence. It's a timing argument based on who is where and when. Okay, but there's a big elephant in the room we have to talk about. A major historical objection that any proponent of this view has to address. And that claim is this: that the whole idea of a pre-tribulation rapture is, well, pretty new. That it was basically invented in the 1800s by an influential theologian named John Nelson Darby. But proponents of the doctrine say not so fast. They argue that if you look closer at history, you can find the core concept of a pre-tribulation removal of the saints much, much earlier than the 19th century. And this is their key piece of evidence. It's a quote from a sermon by a guy named Saint Ephrem, way back in the 4th century. And, you read it, gathered prior to the tribulation, taken to the Lord. It really does sound a lot like the same concept, just 1,500 years before Darby. So let's put it all together. The case for a pre-tribulation rapture is built like a legal case, right? You've got linguistics tracing harpazo to rapture. You've got historical precedents like Enoch and Noah. There's a core theological argument about escaping God's wrath. You have symbolic parallels in wedding traditions. And finally, a defense against the historical objection that it's a new idea. But it's so important to remember that for people who hold this view, this isn't just an academic debate about a timeline of the future. It's way more personal than that. It's a source of profound comfort, an assurance of rescue, and what the Bible itself calls a blessed hope. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. When you build a doctrine like this, piecing it together from linguistic clues, historical patterns, and symbolic texts from all over the Bible, does that process make the final picture stronger and more complete? Or is the picture you end up with really just a reflection of the person who was putting all the pieces together?